In the early 1960s, nestled deep within the Carpathian Mountains, there lay a secluded village in the heart of Transylvania, Romania, isolated from the outside world. The village sat shrouded in mist and shadow, surrounded by dense, ancient forests that whispered secrets to those who dared to enter. The towering peaks of the Carpathians loomed in the distance, their jagged silhouettes often lost in the swirling clouds. Here, time moved slowly, and the weight of history pressed upon every home, every path, and every soul. The village was small, a scattering of wooden cottages with steeply sloped roofs, built to withstand the heavy snows of winter. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, blending with the perpetual fog that blanketed the land. Narrow dirt paths wove through the settlement, connecting homes to the village square, where an old church with faded walls stood as a silent guardian. Bells tolled softly at dawn and dusk, marking the passing of time and calling villagers to prayer. To outsiders, it was a picture of quaint rural life. To those who lived there, it was a place of both peace and ever-present dread. Life in the village was defined by ritual and tradition. The people were farmers and shepherds, their days consumed by tilling the soil, tending to livestock, and gathering firewood. Seasons dictated their lives. Spring brought renewal, summer toil, autumn the harvest, and winter an endless, suffocating cold. Yet beyond the physical hardships, there existed a deeper struggle, a constant wariness of the unseen forces that lurked in the periphery of their world. From a young age, villagers were taught to fear the forest. The thick, gnarled trees seemed alive, their branches clawing at the sky as if trying to trap the sunlight. Legends told of creatures that roamed beneath the forest's canopy, restless spirits, wolves with glowing eyes, and the dreaded strigoi. Unlike the romanticized vampires of distant lands, the strigoi were something far more insidious. They were the undead, tormented souls who clawed their way back from the grave to feed on the blood of the living. Whispers of their existence passed from generation to generation, fueling nightmares and superstition. Amidst this dark tapestry lived the Andre family. Their home stood on the edge of the village, perilously close to the forest line. It was a modest dwelling, built from sturdy timber and stone, with a thatched roof that creaked under the weight of snow. A low wooden fence surrounded the property, though it offered little protection from the unknown. Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with the scent of herbs hung to dry, a practice maintained by Maria, the family matriarch. She was a woman of deep knowledge and quiet wisdom, revered for her understanding of ancient remedies and protective charms. Maria lived with her son, Andre, a man in his early 40s, whose broad shoulders and weathered hands bore the marks of years of labor. His wife, Elena, shared his burdens with quiet grace, weaving fabrics to trade at the local market. Together, they had 2 children, Mihai, an inquisitive boy of 8, and Anna, a bright-eyed girl just 3 years old. To outsiders, they seemed like any other family, ordinary, hardworking, and content. Yet the isolation of their home, with its proximity to the shadows of the forest, often gave it a somber, haunted air. The villagers, though close-knit, kept to themselves, bound together by shared fears and unshakable beliefs. Garlic was hung above doorways to ward off evil, and mirrors were draped during times of mourning so that wandering spirits could not become trapped. When someone died, coins were placed on their eyes, and their body was watched over for days to ensure it remained still. For in this village, death was never taken lightly, and neither was the possibility of its return. Despite the ominous undertones of their existence, there was beauty in the life they lived. On feast days, the village square would come alive with music, laughter, and the scent of roasted meats. Traditional dances were performed to the sound of the cymbalum and pan flute, offering a moment of reprieve from the ever-present unease. Such moments, though fleeting, reminded the villagers that life was still theirs to cherish, even as darkness loomed on the horizon. But as winter approached, the village's atmosphere grew heavier. The days shortened, and the nights stretched long and bitterly cold. Shadows deepened in the forest, and the howling of unseen animals became more frequent. A sense of foreboding settled over the land, an unspoken fear that something or someone might be stirring. It was in this time, when the cold pressed hard against the walls of their home, that the Andre family story began. A story that would test their courage, unravel their beliefs, and plunge them into the heart of an ancient terror that had slept far too long. For in Transylvania, where myths breathed as heavily as men, the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin. And for those who lived near the shadows, it was only a matter of time before something crossed it. The first snowfall of winter came unexpectedly early that year, blanketing the village in silence. The wind blew fiercely through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and extinguishing the few lanterns that lit the night. Andre woke before dawn, his breath visible in the biting chill of their modest home. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the room frigid and still. He quietly rose from bed, careful not to disturb Elena and the children, who slept soundly in the next room. Outside, the world was cloaked in white, the forest a jagged silhouette against the pale morning light. That day, Andre and Elena had planned to travel to the Bargau market, a trading post several hours away by horse-drawn cart. Supplies were running low. Flour, salt, and candles were needed to endure the unforgiving winter ahead. They had debated the trip the night before, knowing it meant leaving Maria alone with the children. But the urgency outweighed their hesitation. Maria, ever stoic, had assured them she could manage. "Go," she said firmly, her voice strong despite her frailty. "I've lived through harsher winters than this." As the cart disappeared down the narrow, snow-covered path, Maria watched from the window, her face calm but unreadable. Mihai and Anna sat on the floor, playing with wooden toys their father had carved months earlier. A strange quiet settled over the house, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the children's voices. Hours passed slowly, the sun tracing a low arc across the sky. By early afternoon, the snow began to fall again, heavier this time, the flakes swirling in chaotic patterns. Maria felt it in her bones, an unease, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the edges of her perception. She clutched the rosary she always kept near, whispering prayers under her breath. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a faint knock at the door. Maria froze, her knuckles tightening around the rosary beads. No one ever visited this far from the village, especially in weather like this. She approached the door cautiously, her worn slippers silent against the wooden floorboards. Peering through the cracks, she saw no one, only the snow falling thick and heavy. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm but tinged with doubt. No answer came. With a deep breath, Maria bolted the door and returned to the fire, dismissing the noise as nothing more than her imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. Yet the unease clung to her, growing heavier with each passing minute. The children, oblivious to their grandmother's discomfort, continued their play, their laughter ringing hollow in the hushed house. As the day turned to night, the snowfall intensified. Andre and Elena were delayed on their return, forced to navigate treacherous roads slick with ice and buried under a growing blanket of snow. By the time they reached the outskirts of the village, darkness had fallen, and the forest had taken on an unnatural stillness. Even the horses seemed unnerved, their breath steaming in the frigid air as they trudged forward. When they finally arrived home, the house was dark, save for the faint glow of embers still smoldering in the hearth. Andre pulled the cart to a stop, his boots crunching against the snow as he climbed down. Something felt wrong. The house, which should have been warm and alive with the sounds of family, stood eerily quiet. Elena, sensing his unease, clutched his arm. "Something's not right," she whispered. Andre nodded grimly and pushed open the front door. The cold rushed to meet them, unnatural and heavy, as if the air itself had died. Inside, the house was silent. The children's toys lay scattered on the floor, forgotten. A chill crept over Andre's spine as his eyes swept the room, finally settling on the figure of his mother, sitting motionless in her chair by the hearth. "Mother?" Andre's voice broke the silence, but there was no response. Elena stifled a gasp as they moved closer, Maria's face was pale, her eyes open but unseeing, staring blankly at the ashes of the fire. Her hands, still clutching the rosary, had gone rigid. The rosary beads were cracked, splintered in places, as though gripped with unnatural force. Her body sat unnaturally still, frozen in a position that looked neither peaceful nor natural. "Mama!" Andre's voice trembled as he knelt before her, gently shaking her shoulder. Her body was cold and stiff. She was gone. Elena clutched her mouth, muffling a cry as she pulled Mihai and Anna close to her chest. The children, woken by the sound of their parents' voices, looked on with confusion, their young minds unable to comprehend what had happened. Andre stood slowly, his face pale as the blood drained from it. "There were no signs," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was fine this morning." The suddenness of Maria's death sent shockwaves through the village. Word spread quickly, carried by the whispers of those who dared to speak of it. "Unnatural," the villagers said, exchanging nervous glances. Death was a common enough companion in their harsh world. But there was something about this death, its quiet, its inexplicable finality, that felt wrong. The priest, Father Nikolai, arrived the next morning to offer blessings and prepare Maria's body for burial. A tall, gaunt man with a perpetually stern expression. He was well versed in the folklore of the region and sensitive to signs of strigoi. He examined the body with a solemn intensity, murmuring prayers as he did so. "No illness," he said finally, looking up at Andre. "No marks. No wounds." Andre nodded, his jaw tight. "It doesn't make sense. She wasn't sick. She was strong." Father Nikolai placed a hand on Andre's shoulder. "Sometimes, the body fails without warning. It is God's will." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in the priest's eyes. He turned to the family. "Tonight, we will hold vigil here. It is important that the body is not left alone." That evening, the house was filled with neighbors and family, all gathered to pay their respects and hold vigil. Candles were placed in each corner of the room where Maria's body lay, wrapped in white linen. On a table in the center, the light cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Andre sat beside his mother's body, his face lined with grief and exhaustion. Elena tended to the children, though Mihai was restless, his wide eyes darting nervously toward the body. As the hours crept by, the atmosphere grew heavier. Conversations turned to hushed whispers, and many avoided looking at Maria directly. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the house, a mournful sound that seemed almost like a voice. Shortly after midnight, Mihai, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, suddenly let out a sharp gasp. "Baba is outside," he whispered, his voice trembling. The room fell silent. "What did you say?" Elena asked sharply, her voice shaking. Mihai pointed to the window. "I saw her. Outside. She was looking at me." Several villagers exchanged nervous glances. Andre rose to his feet and went to the window, his heart pounding. He saw nothing but darkness, the snow swirling in the wind. Yet the boy's words hung in the air, refusing to be dismissed. "Go back to bed, Mihai," Andre said firmly, though his voice betrayed his unease. But deep down, he knew the strigoi were real in the minds of the villagers, and Maria's sudden, unexplained death had already begun to sow seeds of fear. As the hours passed, the vigil continued, but no one slept. Outside, the wind carried whispers through the trees, as though the forest itself was watching. The vigil continued long into the night, the air inside the house growing thick with unease. The candles flickered erratically as though disturbed by a breeze that no one could feel, their light casting ghostly shadows that clung to the walls like living things. Outside, the wind howled mournfully, rising and falling in waves, its voice mimicking the cries of unseen creatures hidden deep in the forest. It was the kind of night that made even the bravest men uneasy. Andre sat stiffly near his mother's body, his face pale and worn. The events of the day had drained him, yet he dared not close his eyes. Elena sat in a corner, clutching Anna tightly to her chest, her eyes darting between the candles and the window. Mihai, restless and unable to sleep, huddled close to his father, his young face twisted with confusion and fear. Around them, the villagers murmured quiet prayers, their voices rising and falling in a somber chorus. None dared speak of the unease settling upon them, but it lingered like smoke, palpable and suffocating. By now, the snow outside had stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. It was as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for something, something none could name but all could feel. Around midnight, Father Nikolai stood to address the room. The villagers quieted, their murmurs fading to a tense silence. The priest's gaunt figure seemed taller in the flickering candlelight, his face grave and lined with shadows. "We are gathered here tonight to guide Maria's soul to eternal rest," he said, his voice low but firm. "The vigil is sacred. Her body must not be left unattended. For the time between death and burial is when the spirit is most vulnerable." His words, though solemn, carried a deeper meaning that hung unspoken in the room. Everyone knew the folklore, the belief that restless spirits, if not watched, could find their way back to the world of the living. None dared voice it aloud, but the fear of the Strigoi crept into their thoughts like a dark and unwelcome guest. Father Nikolai began reciting prayers again, his voice steady and unyielding, filling the room with a sense of momentary peace. The villagers bowed their heads, the light of their candles reflecting in their eyes. For a while, there was silence, save for the priest's chanting and the occasional crackle of the dying fire. Then, it happened. A sudden thud broke the stillness. It was faint but unmistakable, like the sound of something heavy hitting wood. Heads snapped up. The villagers froze, their eyes darting around the room. Father Nikolai paused mid-chant, his gaze sharp and searching. "What was that?" someone whispered. Andre rose to his feet, his heart pounding. He turned to the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, only the cold wind rattling against the shutters. Another thud. This time it was louder, closer. It seemed to come from the direction of the window. "The wind," Andre muttered, trying to reassure himself as much as the others. "It's just the wind." "No," Mihai whispered, his voice trembling. "It's Baba. She's outside." The room fell silent again. A collective chill rippled through those gathered. Andre shot a sharp look at his son, but before he could speak, a faint scratching sound began, soft and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the window. Elena's breath hitched as she clutched Anna tighter. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it became an unbearable screech. Then, without warning, the window burst open, the shutters slamming violently against the walls. The candles sputtered and went out, plunging the room into near darkness. Screams erupted as villagers scrambled to relight the candles. Father Nikolai shouted for calm, his voice drowned out by the chaos. Andre grabbed a lantern and turned toward the window, his hands shaking as he held it aloft. What he saw froze him in place. Standing just beyond the window, bathed in pale moonlight, was his mother, Maria. Her figure swayed unnaturally, her thin nightgown billowing in the icy wind. Her face was pale as death, her eyes wide and empty, staring straight at Andre. Her mouth hung slightly open, as though trying to speak, but unable to form words. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her gaunt face, and her hands, those same hands that had held him as a child, were twisted and claw-like, fingers bent at impossible angles. "Baba," Mihai whispered, his voice small and broken. Elena let out a choked cry, clutching her children. The villagers stared in horror, some crossing themselves and others murmuring prayers in a desperate bid for protection. Father Nikolai, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward, holding his crucifix high. "This is not Maria," he proclaimed. "This is a trick of the devil. Begone." But Maria, or whatever it was, did not move. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on her son, empty and unblinking. Then, slowly, she took a step forward, her bare feet sinking into the snow. The movement was jerky, as though her limbs did not quite obey her will. She took another step, and another, until she was at the threshold of the house. Andre's throat went dry. "Mother," he whispered, though he already knew the truth. "Do not let her in." Father Nikolai shouted, his voice sharp with authority. "She is no longer your mother." But Andre was frozen, the lantern trembling in his grip. The figure at the doorway tilted its head, its mouth twitching as though attempting to smile. Then, in a voice that sounded distant and hollow, it whispered, "Andre." The sound of his name coming from those lips shattered what little resolve he had. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as he did so. The villagers screamed, some bolting for the door in a blind panic. Elena clutched the children, sobbing uncontrollably, as Father Nikolai rushed toward the doorway, shouting prayers in a desperate attempt to ward off the creature. Maria took another step inside the house. The fire in the hearth suddenly roared to life, the flames leaping high as though angered by her presence. The candles flickered wildly, their light casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Father Nikolai stood firm, holding his crucifix out before him. "In the name of God, I command you, leave this place," he roared. The figure stopped, its gaze shifting toward the priest. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Maria let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Her face twisted, her mouth opening impossibly wide, and the air grew heavy with a smell of decay. Father Nikolai's prayers grew louder, his voice shaking as he recited scripture. Slowly, the figure began to retreat, its movements jerky and unnatural, until it vanished into the shadows outside. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and the fire abruptly died, plunging the room into silence once more. No one spoke. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of those who remained. Andre fell to his knees, his body trembling as the reality of what he had seen sank in. Elena held the children close, her face buried in Anna's hair as she wept silently. Father Nikolai turned to the villagers, his expression grave. "We must bury the body," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "At dawn." The next morning, when dawn finally broke, the villagers gathered in the frozen cemetery on the outskirts of the village. The air was bitterly cold, the ground hard and unyielding beneath their shovels. Maria's body, still wrapped in its burial shroud, was carried to the gravesite. Andre could not look at her. Elena stood beside him, pale and silent, while Mihai clung to her hand, his eyes wide and fearful. Father Nikolai led the burial rites, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, he sprinkled it with holy water and murmured prayers, his gaze flickering toward the forest as though expecting something or someone to emerge from its shadows. When the grave was filled, the villagers lingered only long enough to ensure the earth was packed firm. Some whispered that iron nails should have been driven through the body's limbs to prevent it from rising again, but none dared say it aloud in Father Nikolai's presence. As they returned to their homes, the forest seemed to watch them, silent and knowing, but deep in his heart, Andre knew this was not the end. Something had awoken, and it was not yet finished. The day after Maria's burial, the Andre household sat shrouded in silence. Though the villagers had returned to their routines, whispers of the previous night's events lingered in the air like an invisible plague. No one dared speak of what they had seen, Maria's unnatural return, the guttural sounds, or the way her lifeless body had moved as if something else animated it. Yet the fear clung to everyone's hearts, an unshakable truth they could not admit aloud. Andre hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into a bowl of untouched porridge. Dark circles lined his sunken eyes, and his face had taken on a hollow, gaunt quality. Elena, who had been quiet all morning, moved about the house with a restless energy, clutching the rosary that had belonged to Maria. "Mihai says he heard her again," Elena whispered suddenly, breaking the silence. Andre looked up sharply. "What?" Elena's voice trembled. "He said he heard Baba whispering his name last night from outside the window." Andre stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the wooden floor. "It's just the boy's imagination," he said harshly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. This is over. She's buried. It's finished." But even as he said it, he didn't believe the words. The image of his mother, her vacant, dead eyes, the twisted movements, haunted his mind like a recurring nightmare. That night, the wind began to howl again. The children were put to bed early, but Mihai refused to close his eyes. He huddled beneath his thin blanket, his ears straining for the sounds he feared might come. Elena and Andre lay in their own bed, silent and stiff, neither able to sleep. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting faint shadows on the walls. But even the warm glow of the flames seemed powerless against the oppressive cold that had settled over the house. Sometime past midnight, the scratching started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of nails gently tapping against wood. Andre stirred, his eyes snapping open. The room was dark, save for the faint light of the dying fire. He held his breath, listening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window. Andre bolted upright, his pulse hammering in his chest. Elena stirred beside him, her voice hoarse with sleep. "What is it?" "Shoo," Andre hissed, holding up a hand. He turned toward the window, where the sound continued. The shutters rattled slightly, though there was no wind. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. A silence fell over the room, heavy and unnatural. Andre waited, his entire body tense. When nothing else happened, he exhaled shakily and sank back onto the bed. "It's nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to Elena. "The house settling. Go back to sleep." But Elena did not respond. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face pale and terrified. "Andre," she whispered. "Look." He turned. A shadow passed across the window. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the dying firelight. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate, like a figure pacing outside the house. Andre's blood ran cold. He threw back the blanket and grabbed the lantern beside the bed. "Stay here," he ordered Elena, his voice shaking. She clutched the rosary tighter but said nothing. Andre crept to the window, every step loud in the unbearable silence. He held up the lantern, its weak light spilling across the frost-covered glass. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, just as he was about to turn away, something moved. A face. It was pale and sunken, with wide, unblinking eyes staring in at him. Maria. Andre staggered back, the lantern slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor. Elena screamed. The shadow outside the window disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Andre stood frozen, his mind unable to process what he had seen. "She's gone," he whispered. She's buried. She can't." Elena was sobbing, rocking back and forth as she clutched the children, who had been woken by the noise. Mihai stared at his father, his eyes wide with terror. "It's Baba," he whispered. "She's back." Over the next few days, the strange events continued. The animals in the barn began dying. It started with the chickens. Andre found them one morning, their lifeless bodies sprawled across the floor, their necks twisted at unnatural angles. Blood had pooled beneath them, though there were no signs of what had attacked them. A few days later, one of the goats was discovered dead in the same manner. Its eyes were wide open, its body unnaturally stiff, as though frozen in fear. Elena begged Andre to leave the house, to take the children and flee. "Something is wrong here." "Andre," she cried, clutching his arm. "We have to leave before it's too late." But Andre refused. "And go where? The village will think we're mad. This is our home." He tried to dismiss the events as coincidence, foxes attacking the animals, the cold weather killing the weaker livestock. But deep down, he knew better. Something was very wrong. The villagers began to notice the Andre family's absence from church and gatherings. Whispers spread that something unnatural lingered at the edge of the forest. Some spoke of seeing strange lights flickering in the Andre house late at night, or hearing faint screams carried on the wind. None dared venture too close. They spoke only in hushed tones, crossing themselves whenever Maria's name was mentioned. One evening, Father Nikolai arrived at the Andre house. His face was lined with exhaustion, his expression grim. "You must leave this place," he said to Andre, his voice low but urgent. This is no longer a house of the living. Andre bristled. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see what's happening? The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. There are ways to deal with this, he said quietly, but you must act quickly. What do you mean? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Father Nikolai hesitated, as though weighing his words. The dead must not walk among the living. If Maria's spirit has been disturbed, it must be put to rest. And how do we do that? Andre demanded. The priest looked him in the eyes. By unearthing her body and driving a stake through her heart. Elena gasped, clutching her chest. No, we can't. There is no other way. Father Nikolai said firmly, if she has become Strigoi, she will not stop. She will consume this house, your family, your souls. That night, Andre sat alone by the dying fire, his mind racing. The priest's words echoed in his ears. Unearth her body. Drive a stake through her heart. He shuddered. How could he desecrate his own mother's grave? How could he bring himself to do such a thing? But as he sat there, staring into the embers, he heard it again. The scratching. Slow, deliberate, coming from the front door this time. And then a voice. Andre. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. He felt the blood drain from his face as he turned toward the door. The voice came again, louder this time. Andre, let me in. He rose shakily to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was his mother's, yet it was not hers. It was hollow, cold, and filled with something that made his skin crawl. He stumbled back as the door began to rattle, as though someone, was trying to force its way inside. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face white with terror. Don't open it, she screamed. The door shook violently, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. Andre stood frozen, his breath ragged. Then he heard it, soft and distant, but clear. A low, guttural laugh. It came from the other side of the door. By dawn, Andre made his decision. He would do as Father Nikolai had instructed. He would go to Maria's grave and put an end to whatever dark force had taken hold of her. But he was too late. When he arrived at the cemetery, the ground above Maria's grave was disturbed. The earth was churned and broken, as though something had clawed its way out from below. Maria was gone. The sun had barely risen, yet it brought no warmth or comfort to Andre as he stared at the desecrated grave. The ground that had once held his mother's body was ripped open. The earth churned into deep, claw-like grooves. The simple wooden cross marking her grave lay broken, half buried in the disturbed soil. Nearby, the priest, Father Nikolai, stood silently, his face pale and taut. She has risen, the priest whispered, crossing himself. It is as I feared. Andre fell to his knees, his hands digging into the cold, damp earth. How can this be? He rasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. What evil is this? Father Nikolai knelt beside him, his hand firm on Andre's shoulder. Listen to me, Andre. This is no longer your mother. Maria's spirit has been corrupted, turned into something monstrous. The Strigoi are real as the ground you kneel upon. The curse has taken her, and she walks this earth as an abomination. Andre clenched his fists, his mind racing. The events of the past days, the scratching at the windows, the animals dying, the voice calling his name, came rushing back with sickening clarity. He had denied it, fought to dismiss it as madness. But now the truth could no longer be ignored. We must act. Father Nikolai continued. If we do not stop her, the curse will spread. She will drain life wherever she goes. Your family, your village, everything. We must find her, confront her, and destroy the evil that animates her. Andre looked up at the priest, his eyes dark with resolve. What must I do? Back at the Andre household, Elena paced the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared a weak broth. The children sat silently at the table. Mihai kept glancing at the window, his face pale and gaunt. Anna clung to her wooden doll, rocking back and forth as if trying to comfort herself. The air inside the house felt wrong, heavy and cold. even as the fire burned brightly in the hearth. "Mama," Mihai whispered suddenly, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. Elena turned to him, her heart lurching at the look on his face. "What is it?" "I saw her again. Last night." His voice trembled. "Baba was outside the window. She was watching me." Elena's blood ran cold. She rushed to the boy and knelt in front of him, grasping his shoulders tightly. "No, Mihai," she said firmly, though her voice quivered. "It's just a nightmare. Baba is gone." Mihai shook his head violently. "No, it wasn't a dream. I heard her. She said my name. Mama. She said she was coming back for me." Elena choked back a sob, pulling the boy into her arms. "Hush, my love. It's all right. Nothing can hurt you while I'm here." But even as she said it, she felt the cold fingers of dread crawling up her spine. She turned her gaze toward the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at her from the gloom. That night, Andrei returned home with Father Nikolai, carrying a bundle of wooden stakes, garlic bulbs, and a small bottle of holy water. Elena watched in silence as they moved through the house, hanging garlic over every window and door. The children huddled in the corner, wide-eyed and silent. "We will keep watch tonight," Father Nikolai said, his voice calm but commanding. "No one must leave the house. No one must open the doors or windows, no matter what you hear." "What happens if she comes?" Elena whispered, her face pale. The priest turned to her, his gaze hard. "Then we must confront her." As darkness fell, the house grew deathly silent. Andrei sat by the front door, a wooden stake and hammer clutched tightly in his hands. Father Nikolai knelt by the hearth, murmuring prayers under his breath. Elena sat with the children, stroking Anna's hair as she fought to calm her own racing heart. Hours passed. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. Outside, the forest loomed, its shadowy depths hidden by the blackness of the night. Then it began. A faint tap-tap-tap at the window. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Mihai whimpered, clutching her arm. "She's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It moved from one window to the next, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. Andrei gripped the stake tighter, his knuckles white. Father Nikolai stood, holding up his crucifix as he moved toward the center of the room. "Andrei," the voice came again, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "Andrei, let me in." Andrei's heart froze. It was Maria's voice, his mother's voice, calling to him from beyond the grave. It sounded so familiar, so real, that for a moment he almost believed it. "Andrei," the voice whispered again, this time closer. "My son, it's so cold out here. Let me in. Do not listen to her." Father Nikolai shouted, his voice breaking the spell. "It is not your mother." The windows began to rattle violently, as though battered by a storm. The wind howled, carrying with it the low, guttural growl they had heard before. Then, with a deafening crash, one of the shutters blew open, and the room was plunged into chaos. A shadow loomed in the broken window, its outline grotesque and inhuman. Maria's face appeared in the darkness, her eyes glowing faintly with a sickly red light. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, blood-stained teeth. "Mihai," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against glass. "Come to Baba." The boy screamed. "Back, demon!" Father Nikolai roared, throwing holy water toward the window. The droplets hissed as they struck the shadowy figure, smoke rising where they touched. Maria let out an ear-piercing screech, her face contorting in pain as she withdrew into the darkness. The house trembled, the very walls seeming to shudder under the weight of the unholy presence. Andrei rushed to the window and slammed the shutters closed, bolting them tight. "Is she gone?" Elena cried, clutching Anna to her chest. Father Nikolai lowered his crucifix, his face drenched in sweat. "For now, but she will return." By dawn, the house was silent again. The events of the night had left everyone shaken and exhausted. Father Nikolai sat at the table, his hands clasped in prayer, as Andrei paced back and forth across the room. This cannot continue, Andre said finally, his voice hoarse. What do we do? Father? How do we end this? Father Nikolai looked up, his expression grim. We must find her. Andre frowned. Find her? The priest nodded. Her body. It must be destroyed. A stake must be driven through her heart, and her head severed from her body. Only then will the curse be broken. Andre's stomach turned at the thought. To desecrate his mother's body in such a way felt like a betrayal, but he knew there was no other choice. He glanced at Elena, who sat silently with the children, her face pale and haunted. I will do it, Andre said, his voice hard. Tonight. Father Nikolai stood, placing a hand on his shoulder. You will not do it alone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Andre and Father Nikolai set out into the forest, armed with wooden stakes, holy water, and the priest's crucifix. They moved in grim silence, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The forest was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. She will be drawn to where she died, Father Nikolai murmured as they walked, or where she was buried. We must search the old graveyard. The two men pressed on, the darkness closing in around them. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind a whisper in their ears. Then, as they neared the clearing where Maria had been buried, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Andre froze, his pulse quickening. What is that? Father Nikolai held up his crucifix, his voice low. She is near. They stepped into the clearing, and there she was. Maria stood in the center of her open grave, her body unnaturally twisted, her head snapped toward them, her glowing red eyes locking onto Andre. A low growl escaped her throat, and her lips curled into a hideous grin. Andre, she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. My son. Father Nikolai raised his crucifix, his voice booming. In the name of God, I banish you. Maria shrieked, lunging forward with inhuman speed. Andre dove to the side, narrowly avoiding her grasp. Now, Father Nikolai shouted. Andre grabbed a stake, his hands shaking as he moved toward her. Maria turned to face him, her face contorted with fury. You would kill your own mother, she hissed. You are not my mother. Andre growled through gritted teeth. With a roar, he drove the stake into her chest. Maria let out a blood-curdling scream, her body convulsing violently as the holy water burned her flesh. Father Nikolai pressed his crucifix to her forehead, reciting prayers as the creature's shrieks echoed through the forest. Finally, Maria fell still. Andre collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath as the silence returned. Father Nikolai placed a hand on his shoulder. It is done. But as Andre looked down at the creature that had once been his mother, he could not shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The clearing fell silent as Maria's lifeless body slumped to the ground, the crimson glow fading from her eyes. Andre and Father Nikolai stood in the moonlight, their breath visible in the icy air. The snow beneath Maria's twisted form was stained dark with her blood, which now seemed thick and tar-like. Andre's chest heaved as he stared at the body, his heart torn between relief and a deep, gnawing guilt. Is it over? Andre asked hoarsely, his voice breaking the fragile silence. Father Nikolai hesitated before answering, his expression somber. For her, perhaps, but the curse is not so easily undone. What do you mean? Andre demanded, his voice rising. We destroyed her. Isn't that what you said would end this? The priest looked down at Maria's body, his brow furrowed in thought. The Strigoi is only one piece of the curse, he said carefully. The evil that awakened her does not vanish so simply. It lingers, spreads. We have cut the weed, but the roots remain. Andre's stomach turned as he looked at the lifeless figure before him. The thought of something darker, more powerful, behind Maria's transformation filled him with dread. What happens now? He asked. We must pray. Father Nikolai said grimly. Pray that it does not spread further. When Andre and Father Nikolai returned to the house, They were met with anxious faces. Elena rushed to Andre, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you find her?" she asked, clutching his arm. "Did you end it?" Andre nodded slowly. "She's gone," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We ended it." Elena exhaled shakily, relief momentarily washing over her face. But the tension in the room did not dissipate. The children huddled near the hearth, their eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting to see Maria's face staring back at them. "We must be vigilant," Father Nikolai said, addressing the family. "The house must remain protected. Keep the garlic and holy symbols in place. Do not let your guard down." "And what about the villagers?" Elena asked. "Should we tell them?" The priest shook his head. "Not yet. Panic will only make things worse. We must see if the curse abates first." In the days that followed, the Andre household remained on edge. Though Maria was gone, a sense of unease lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to lift. The children began to complain of strange noises in the night, whispers in the walls, footsteps on the roof, faint laughter echoing through the house. At first, Andre and Elena dismissed it as residual fear, the children's imaginations running wild after the trauma they had endured. But soon, the occurrences became impossible to ignore. One night, Elena woke to the sound of faint crying. She turned toward the children's room, her heart pounding. "Mihai," she called softly. The crying stopped. She rose from the bed, careful not to wake Andre, and crept toward the door. The sound resumed as she neared the children's room, louder now, more distinct. It wasn't Mihai or Anna. It was a voice she recognized all too well. "Baba," it whispered, thick with sorrow. "Why did you leave me?" Elena froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The voice sounded so much like Maria that for a moment, she felt a pang of guilt, but she shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Maria was gone. This was a trick. It had to be. Suddenly, the crying turned to laughter, cold, sharp, and cruel. The sound echoed through the house, waking Andre and the children. Elena stumbled back, her hands trembling. "What is it?" Andre demanded, rushing to her side. "She's here," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's still here." As the strange occurrences escalated, the Andre family's behavior began to draw the attention of the villagers. They noticed how Andre avoided the square, how Elena's face grew pale and gaunt, how the children no longer played outside. Rumors began to spread, whispers of dark magic, of a curse that had taken hold of the family. One evening, a group of villagers, led by the stern and suspicious Georgia, approached the Andre house. They knocked loudly on the door, their faces shadowed by the flickering torchlight. Andre opened the door cautiously, his expression wary. "What is it?" he asked. Georgia stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We've heard things, Andre, things about your family, about Maria." Andre's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" "She's been seen," Georgia said, his voice low. "In the forest, near the old graveyard. People say they've heard her voice, felt her presence." "That's impossible," Andre snapped. "She's gone. We buried her." Georgia's gaze hardened. "Whatever you've done, Andre, it's brought something dark to this village. If you can't stop it, we will." The villagers murmured their agreement, their faces grim. Andre closed the door without another word, his hands shaking. That night, the Andre family barricaded themselves inside the house, fearful of both the villagers and the unseen forces that seemed to close in around them. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and the fire in the hearth flickered as if threatened by an invisible hand. At midnight, the noises began again. This time, it was not just whispers or footsteps. It was a cacophony of sound, screams, growls, the crashing of unseen forces against the walls. The house shook as though gripped by an earthquake, the floorboards groaning under an unbearable weight. Andre grabbed the wooden stakes and holy water, his heart racing. "Stay with the children," he shouted to Elena. "Do not let them out of your sight." Suddenly, the front door slammed open, the force nearly ripping it from its hinges. A gust of freezing wind rushed into the house, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into darkness. In the doorway stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct but radiating malice. "Andre," the figure hissed, its voice a distorted echo of Maria's. "You cannot escape me." Andre stepped forward, his hands shaking as he held the crucifix aloft. "Leave us," he shouted. "You have no power here." The figure laughed, a sound that made the walls tremble. "You think you can defy me? The curse is already inside you, inside your family." As the figure advanced, Andre threw the holy water, the liquid hissing and steaming as it struck the shadow. The figure recoiled with a shriek, its form flickering like a dying flame before vanishing into the night. When dawn finally broke, the house was silent once more, but the family was left shaken and exhausted. Father Nikolai arrived shortly after, his face grim as he listened to Andre's account of the night's events. "It is as I feared," the priest said. "The curse did not end with Maria. Something darker has taken root here, something that will not rest until it consumes you all. What can we do?" Elena pleaded, her voice breaking. Father Nikolai sighed heavily. "The curse is tied to the land, to the sins of those who came before us. To break it, you must leave this place. Forever." Andre looked at him, his face pale. "Leave? This is our home." "It is no longer a home," the priest said. "It is a grave, and if you stay, it will claim you." The Andre family was left with an impossible choice: to abandon their home, their history, and everything they had ever known, or to stay and face the darkness that threatened to consume them. As the sun set once more, casting long shadows across the cursed land, they knew the night would bring no peace, and the curse had only begun to reveal its true depths. The nights grew longer and colder, the darkness outside the Andre house seeming to creep closer with each passing day. Though the priest's warnings lingered in their minds, Andre and Elena could not bring themselves to leave. This was their home, built by Andre's father and his father before him. To abandon it felt like a betrayal of their family and their history, but the price of their decision would soon become unbearable. In the days following the last attack, Anna began to change. The bright, cheerful girl who had once filled the house with laughter grew pale and quiet, her energy drained as if by an invisible hand. She refused to eat, and her once lively eyes took on a hollow, distant look. Elena stayed by her side constantly, coaxing her to take small sips of broth or nibble on pieces of bread. But Anna only shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama," she said one night, as Elena tucked her into bed. "She's here. Baba is here." Elena froze, her hands trembling as she smoothed the blanket over Anna's small frame. "No, my love," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Baba is gone. She can't hurt us anymore." But Anna only stared at her with those empty, unblinking eyes. "She's here," she repeated. "She's watching." Elena's heart ached with helplessness. She pressed a kiss to Anna's forehead, whispering a prayer under her breath before leaving the room. But as she closed the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, too. It happened on the third night after Anna fell ill. The family had barricaded themselves in the main room, as they had done every night since Maria's grave was found empty. Andre sat by the door, a stake and hammer within arm's reach, while Father Nikolai prayed softly near the hearth. Elena stayed close to the children, both of whom slept fitfully on a straw mattress laid out by the fire. The night was deathly quiet. Even the usual howling wind seemed to have stilled, leaving a silence so heavy it felt oppressive. Then, just past midnight, Anna began to stir. At first, it was a faint whimper, barely audible. Elena rushed to her side, brushing the damp hair from her daughter's forehead. "What is it, my love?" she whispered. Anna's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her small hand gripped Elena's wrist weakly, her tiny fingers ice cold. And then, without warning, her body convulsed, her back arching as a strangled cry tore from her throat. "Elena!" Andre shouted, rushing to his daughter's side. Anna's eyes snapped open, wide and glassy, her mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. She's mine, it hissed, low and guttural. You cannot save her. Elena screamed, clutching her daughter as Andre grabbed the crucifix from the table. Leave her, he shouted, pressing the holy symbol to Anna's chest. Her body convulsed violently, a blood-curdling scream erupting from her lips as smoke rose from her skin. Hold her down, Father Nikolai commanded, rushing forward with the bottle of holy water. Andre pinned Anna's thrashing body to the mattress as the priest began to recite prayers, sprinkling holy water over her. The child writhed and screamed, her voice a twisted cacophony of cries and growls that seemed to come from something far older and darker than her small frame. Then, as suddenly as it began, Anna fell still. Elena sobbed, clutching her daughter's lifeless body. Anna, she whispered, shaking her gently. Wake up, my love. Please wake up. But Anna's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, her tiny body limp and cold. She's gone, Father Nikolai said softly, his voice heavy with sorrow. No, Elena screamed, her cries echoing through the house. No, she's not gone. She can't be. Andre sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at his daughter's lifeless form. This can't be happening, he whispered, his voice breaking. She was just a child. Father Nikolai placed a hand on Andre's shoulder. Her soul is free, he said gently, but the darkness that claimed her still lingers. We must end this before it takes another. Word of Anna's death spread quickly through the village. The whispers that had begun weeks earlier now turned into outright accusations. The villagers gathered in the square, their voices rising in anger and fear. They've brought this upon us, Georges shouted, his face red with fury. The Andre family has cursed this village. Their sins have awakened the darkness, and now it's claiming our children. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children tightly, their eyes darting toward the forest as if expecting the darkness to come for them next. We must act, Georges continued, raising his fist. If the Andre family will not rid us of this evil, then we must do it ourselves. The villagers began to arm themselves with torches, pitchforks, and axes, their fear and anger driving them to the Andre house. Andre stood by Anna's small, makeshift coffin, his face pale and drawn. He had spent the day carving the simple wooden box, each strike of the hammer a painful reminder of his failure to protect his child. Elena sat nearby, silent and hollow, her tears long since dried. A knock at the door broke the silence. Father Nikolai opened it cautiously, his face hardening as he saw the mob of villagers gathered outside. We demand answers, Georges shouted, pushing his way to the front. How many more must die before this ends? Father Nikolai stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. The Andre family has done nothing to harm you. They are victims of this curse, just as we all are. Victims? Georges spat. It is their blood that brought this evil upon us, their family's sins. If we do not act, this darkness will consume us all. The mob surged forward, shouting and waving their makeshift weapons. Andre stepped in front of Elena and Mihai, his jaw clenched. We have lost as much as any of you, he said, his voice shaking with anger. This is our fight, not yours. Georges sneered, then ended. Andre, or we will. That night, Father Nikolai proposed a desperate plan. We must return to the forest, he said, his voice heavy with determination. The source of this curse lies there. If we can find it and destroy it, we may yet save what remains of your family and this village. Andre hesitated, glancing at Mihai, who clung to Elena's side. And if we fail, he asked. The priest's expression darkened. Then the curse will claim us all. With no other choice, Andre agreed. As the first light of dawn broke over the cursed land, he and Father Nikolai prepared to face the darkness once more. Armed with stakes, holy water, and unwavering resolve, they ventured into the forest, knowing that they might not return. Elena watched them go, her heart heavy with fear and grief. Come back to us, she whispered, clutching Mihai tightly. But as the forest swallowed them whole, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had already won. The forest loomed dark and foreboding as Andrei and Father Nikolai ventured deeper into its shadowy depths. The twisted trees seemed to close in around them, their bare branches clawing at the pale morning sky. A heavy silence blanketed the woods, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the frost-covered ground. The air was bitterly cold, biting at their faces and hands, but neither man faltered. They both knew what was at stake. "We must be close," Father Nikolai murmured, clutching his crucifix tightly. His breath came out in white puffs, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wind. "The evil that plagues this land is strongest here." Andrei nodded, his grip tightening on the stake in his hand. He had spent the night preparing himself for this moment, pushing aside the grief and guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. Anna's death had left a gaping wound in his heart, but it also fueled his resolve. He would do whatever it took to protect what remained of his family. As they pressed on, the forest seemed to change around them. The trees grew thicker and more twisted, their bark blackened and gnarled as if scorched by some unseen fire. The ground beneath their feet became uneven, riddled with roots that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. A foul stench filled the air, sharp and metallic, making Andrei gag. "We're close," Father Nikolai said again, his voice tense. He stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Andrei followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. In a small clearing stood an ancient stone altar, weathered and cracked with age. It was covered in dark, sticky stains that Andrei did not want to identify. Around the altar, the earth was black and charred, as if burned by an otherworldly fire. Strange symbols had been carved into the stones, their jagged lines seeming to pulse with a faint, malevolent glow. "This is it," Father Nikolai said, his voice trembling. "This is where it began." Andrei stared at the altar, a sense of dread washing over him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest pulled a vial of holy water from his coat and handed it to Andrei. "We must consecrate the ground, destroy the altar. It's the only way to sever the curse at its source." Andrei nodded, his hands shaking as he uncorked the vial. As he stepped forward, a sudden chill swept through the clearing, far colder than the winter air. The wind howled around them, carrying with it a sound that froze Andrei in his tracks. Laughter, low and guttural. It echoed through the forest, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Andrei spun around, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted. The laughter grew louder, more menacing. Shadows began to move at the edge of the clearing, twisting and shifting into shapes that made Andrei's stomach turn. Eyes glowed in the darkness, red and hungry, watching their every move. Father Nikolai raised his crucifix, his voice firm. "Do not be afraid. The Lord is with us." But even as he spoke, the shadows advanced, their movements unnaturally fast. Andrei gripped the stake in one hand and the vial of holy water in the other. His muscles tensed as the first figure lunged at him. The creature was barely human, its body twisted and emaciated, its face a grotesque mockery of a man's, its mouth stretched wide in a snarl, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Andrei swung the stake with all his strength, driving it into the creature's chest. It let out an ear-piercing screech before collapsing to the ground, its body dissolving into black ash. Another creature lunged at Father Nikolai, who held up his crucifix and shouted a prayer. The creature recoiled, its flesh burning where the holy symbol touched it. Andrei threw the vial of holy water at a third figure, the liquid sizzling as it struck its target. The creature writhed and screamed before disintegrating into smoke. "They just keep coming," Andrei shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Focus on the altar," Father Nikolai yelled, his voice strained. "Destroy it, and they'll fall." Andrei turned toward the altar, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadows seemed to converge around it, their forms shifting and writhing as if to protect it, summoning every ounce of courage. Andrei charged forward, dodging the grasping claws of the creatures that swarmed him. He reached the altar and smashed the vial of holy water against its surface. The liquid hissed and bubbled, smoke rising from the stone as the symbols carved into it began to fade. Andre grabbed the stake and drove it into the center of the altar, the impact sending a shockwave through the ground. The creatures let out a collective scream, their bodies writhing and disintegrating as the altar crumbled. The red glow faded from the clearing, replaced by an eerie silence. Andre fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Father Nikolai stood nearby, his face pale and weary. "It is done," he said quietly, as Andre and Father Nikolai made their way back through the forest. A sense of relief began to creep over them. The oppressive darkness that had clung to the woods seemed to have lifted, replaced by a faint light that filtered through the trees. But their relief was short-lived. When they reached the edge of the forest, they saw smoke rising in the distance. Andre's heart sank as he realized it was coming from the direction of his home. "No," he whispered, breaking into a run. Father Nikolai followed, his expression grim. When they arrived at the house, they found the villagers gathered outside, their faces lit by the glow of the flames that consumed the Andre home. "What have you done?" Andre shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. Georges stepped forward, his expression defiant. "We did what you couldn't. We ended it. My family was inside," Andre roared, rushing toward the burning house. Two villagers grabbed him, holding him back as he struggled against them. "They're gone, Andre," Georges said coldly. "They were as cursed as the land." "You don't know that," Andre screamed, his voice breaking. Father Nikolai stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "You have committed a great sin," he said, his voice trembling. "The curse is not ended. It is now on you." The villagers murmured uneasily, some lowering their torches. Georges sneered. "We did what needed to be done." Andre sank to his knees, his body racked with sobs as the house burned before him. The smoke rose into the sky, carrying with it the last remnants of his family's life. In the days that followed, the Andre family's story became a cautionary tale whispered among the villagers. The Andre land was abandoned, left to the weeds and the shadows that still lingered. Georges and those who had led the mob were shunned, their guilt a weight they could not escape. Andre, consumed by grief and rage, disappeared into the forest, vowing to find a way to end the curse once and for all. Father Nikolai returned to the church, his faith shaken but unbroken. He prayed daily for the souls of those lost, but he knew the darkness was not gone. For the curse had not been destroyed, it had only changed hands. And as the first snow of winter fell over the village, the shadows in the forest stirred once more, their laughter faint but unmistakable. In the days following the fiery destruction of the Andre home, the village sank into a restless silence. Though Georges and his followers had declared victory over the curse, the air remained heavy with dread. Whispers traveled from house to house, carrying rumors of strange occurrences in the dead of night. At first, it was little things: livestock found dead in their pens, their bodies cold and stiff, eyes wide with terror, crops withering overnight, their leaves blackened as though touched by frost in the middle of summer. The villagers dismissed these incidents as bad luck, natural misfortune, but the signs became harder to ignore. One by one, the children began to fall ill. The first to succumb was Georges' youngest daughter, Irina, a bright and lively girl of 6. She awoke one morning pale and feverish, her small body racked with tremors. She whispered of shadows in her room, of voices calling her name from beyond the window. Georges dismissed her fears as nightmares, brushing aside her pleas to keep the windows closed. "She'll recover," he told his wife gruffly, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. "It's just the cold." But Irina's condition worsened with each passing day. By the third night, she had stopped eating, her once bright eyes dull and unfocused. Georges sat by her bedside, clutching her small hand as she stared blankly at the ceiling. "Baba is coming," she whispered, her voice thin and distant. "She's here." Georges' blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Irina's body convulsed violently. A strangled scream tore from her throat as her back arched unnaturally, her eyes rolling back in her head. Georges shouted for his wife, but by the time she arrived, Irina was gone. Her lifeless body lay limp on the bed, her face frozen in a grimace of terror. Irina's death sent shockwaves through the village. Though Georgia tried to keep the truth hidden, word spread quickly of the strange circumstances surrounding her passing. Soon, other children began to exhibit similar symptoms: fever, lethargy, nightmares filled with shadows and whispers. The villagers turned to Father Nikolai for guidance, their faces pale and drawn. The priest listened to their fears, his heart heavy with guilt. He had warned them not to interfere with the Andre family, had pleaded with them to let him deal with the curse. But they had not listened. Now, the darkness that had plagued the Andre household was spreading, consuming the village piece by piece. "This is the curse," Nikolai said grimly, addressing the frightened crowd in the church. "It has not been broken. It has taken root in the land, and it will not stop until it is purged." "Then what do we do?" a woman cried, clutching her sick child to her chest. "How do we stop it?" The priest hesitated, his gaze drifting to the church's crucifix. "We must cleanse the village," he said finally. "Every home, every field, every shadowed corner must be consecrated. But this alone may not be enough." "What else is there?" Georgia demanded, his voice tinged with desperation. Father Nikolai's face darkened. "The curse began with the Andre family. If there is any hope of ending this, we must find Andre. He may hold the key." Deep in the forest, Andre wandered aimlessly, his mind consumed by grief and rage. The loss of his family had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of the man he once was. He moved like a shadow among the trees, his steps silent, his eyes dull and unfocused. He spoke to no one. There was no one to speak to. The forest had become his prison, its twisted trees and oppressive silence a reflection of the torment within him. Yet even in his despair, Andre felt the presence of something watching him, something dark and patient, waiting for him to break. One night, as Andre sat by a small fire, his head bowed in exhaustion, he heard a familiar voice. "Andre." He froze, his heart pounding. The voice was soft and lilting, filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in weeks. "Andre, my son." His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkness. There, just beyond the firelight, stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It stepped forward, and Andre's breath caught in his throat. It was Maria. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, but her expression was soft and tender. She smiled at him, her lips curling in a way that seemed almost human. "Mother?" Andre whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes, my son," she said, her voice gentle. "I've come back for you." Andre's mind reeled. He had seen her die, had driven the stake into her heart himself. Yet here she was, standing before him, her presence as real as the fire that burned at his feet. "How?" he began, but Maria held up a hand, silencing him. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I am here now, and I can help you. Andre, I can help you end this." "End it?" Andre repeated, his voice filled with doubt. "How?" Maria's smile widened, but there was something in her eyes, something cold and calculating, that made Andre hesitate. "You know what must be done," she said. "The village is the source of the curse. It must be destroyed." "No," Andre said, shaking his head. "It's not the village. It's you." Maria's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing. "Do not turn against me. Andre, I am your mother. I gave you life, and now I can give you peace." Andre rose to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the stake at his belt. "You are not my mother," he said, his voice steady. "You are the curse." Maria's smile disappeared, replaced by a snarl of rage. Her form began to shift, her features twisting into something monstrous. "Then you are my enemy," she hissed, "and you will join me, one way or another." With a deafening roar, she lunged at him. Andre returned to the village the next morning, his body battered and his mind reeling. The fight with Maria had left him shaken, but it had also given him clarity. He could no longer run from the curse. If he wanted to save what remained of the village, and himself, he would have to confront it head-on. The villagers stared as Andre staggered into the square, his clothes torn and bloodied. Georgia stepped forward, his expression a mix of anger and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You've done enough damage. I've come to end this," Andre said, his voice low but firm. "But I'll need your help." George scoffed. "Why should we trust you?" "Because I've seen it," Andre said, his eyes burning with intensity. "I've seen the curse, and I know how to destroy it." Father Nikolai stepped forward, placing a hand on Andre's shoulder. "If he has returned, it is because God has willed it," he said. "We must listen to him." After a tense moment, George relented, nodding reluctantly. "What do we do?" Andre looked at the gathered villagers, his expression grim. "We fight." As night fell, the villagers prepared for the fight of their lives. Torches were lit, weapons were sharpened, and prayers were whispered in every corner of the square. Andre stood at the center of it all, his heart heavy but resolute. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The curse has taken enough from us. It will take no more." The villagers cheered, their voices trembling with both fear and determination. Together, they marched into the forest, their torches casting flickering shadows on the trees. The battle that followed was chaos. The shadows came alive, twisting and writhing as they attacked the villagers with inhuman ferocity. But the villagers fought back with a ferocity of their own, wielding fire and faith against the darkness. Andre and Father Nikolai led the charge, their voices rising above the din as they shouted orders and prayers. The forest trembled under the weight of the battle, its trees groaning and cracking as if in pain. Finally, as dawn broke over the horizon, the shadows began to retreat. The villagers, battered and bloodied, watched in awe as the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The curse was lifted, but as Andre stood amidst the ruins of the battle, he knew that the victory had come at a great cost. Many lives had been lost, and the village would never be the same. Yet for the first time in weeks, the sun shone brightly over the land, and the air was filled not with dread, but with hope. The sun rose over the village for the first time in what felt like an eternity, its warm rays casting light on the battle-scarred land. Smoke curled from the forest where the villagers had fought to break the curse, mingling with the scent of charred wood and earth. The air was still heavy with the weight of what had transpired, and though the shadows had retreated, they left behind a silence that felt unnatural. The survivors returned to the village in solemn procession, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Many bore wounds from the battle, deep gashes, broken bones, and burns, but it was the emotional scars that weighed heaviest. Mothers clung to their children, fathers carried the bodies of fallen loved ones, and those who had no one left walked alone. At the center of it all was Andre. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow as he stared at the destruction that surrounded him. Though the curse had been broken, it had come at an unimaginable cost. His family was gone, his home destroyed, and the village he had once called his own was now a shadow of what it had been. In the days that followed, the villagers began the arduous task of rebuilding their lives. The fields were replanted, the livestock replaced, and the burned homes repaired. Father Nikolai worked tirelessly to offer comfort and guidance, leading prayers in the church and helping to bury the dead. Yet despite their efforts, the village could not shake the sense that something still lingered in the air. The scars of the curse were too deep, the memories too vivid. Every creak of the wind, every rustle of the trees, sent shivers down their spines. The villagers avoided the forest altogether, its edges now overgrown and wild, as if nature itself sought to seal it away. George, once a proud and defiant leader, had become a shadow of his former self. The loss of his daughter Irina had broken him, and he spent his days wandering the village in silence, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The other villagers whispered about him, some blaming him for the curse, others pitying his broken spirit. Andre did not remain in the village. Though the curse had been broken, he could not escape the guilt that consumed him. He had lost everything: his mother, his wife, his children, and no amount of rebuilding could erase the memories of their faces, their laughter, their screams. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Andre packed what little he had left and left the village without a word. He walked into the forest, the same forest that had haunted him for so long, and disappeared into its depths. Father Nikolai searched for him the next day but found no trace. Some said he had gone to find peace. Others believed he had sought out the last remnants of the curse, determined to destroy it completely. But no one saw him again. Over time, the events that had unfolded in the village became the stuff of legend. Travelers passing through the region spoke of a cursed land where shadows moved of their own accord and whispers filled the night air. They told stories of a man who wandered the forest, his face obscured by darkness, his eyes burning with a fierce and sorrowful light. The villagers, now wary of outsiders, rarely spoke of what had happened. The name Andre became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of angering forces beyond human comprehension. Children were told to stay away from the forest, to avoid the Andre land, where the ruins of his home still stood, overgrown with weeds and vines. Yet despite their silence, the villagers could not escape the shadow of what had occurred. Some said they could still hear faint laughter at night, carried on the wind from the direction of the forest. Others claimed to see a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Years later, Father Nikolai, now an old man, stood alone at the edge of the forest. The village had changed over time, new generations rising to take the place of those lost to the curse. But the priest's memories remained sharp, the weight of his failures heavy on his shoulders. He held a worn crucifix in his hands, the same one he had carried into the forest on that fateful night. He raised it to the sky, his voice trembling as he began to pray. "Lord, grant us peace," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind. "Forgive our sins, and watch over those who were lost. Protect this land from the darkness that once consumed it." As he finished his prayer, a soft breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment, he thought he heard a voice, a faint, distant whisper. "Thank you." Father Nikolai opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Whether it was his imagination or something more, he could not say. But in that moment, he felt a weight lift from his soul. The forest remains to this day, its twisted trees and shadowed paths untouched by time. Few dare to enter, and those who do often return with stories of strange sights and sounds. A flicker of movement just out of view, a voice calling softly from the darkness. The village, though quiet and peaceful on the surface, carries its own ghosts. The children who play in the square speak in hushed tones of the Andre house, of the man who disappeared into the forest, and of the shadows that still linger in the corners of their dreams. And though the sun rises each morning, casting its golden light over the village, the people know that the shadows will always be there, waiting. For in this land, where the line between life and death is thin, the past is never truly gone, and the curse, though broken, will never truly die.